In this video, we are going to look at D2L Arithmetic Questions 2 plus 2, or 2 plus 2 problems for short. We will switch to D2L in just a moment. Also, I'm going to assume that you have some experience writing D2L questions, so I may gloss over some general knowledge details. If you're writing test questions with numeric answers, which type of question do you prefer? The multiple choice question on the left or the question with the answer box on the right? Before you answer, know that both of them are automatically graded by D2L. Most likely, you selected the question on the right. That's a 2 plus 2 question. Before we switch to D2L, let's talk about the advantages of 2 plus 2 questions. You may have heard that 2 plus 2 questions require the answer use some type of calculation. Nothing could be further from the truth. 2 plus 2 questions can be used for absolutely any question that has a number as an answer. After all, finding out the number of states does not require any calculations. For multiple choice questions, you have to write out possible answers when you write the questions. For the state question, I use categories of size 15. Someone else might have used categories of 10. Making that decision is a big part of writing multiple choice questions. Since a 2 plus 2 question does not display a list of possible answers, this is not required. Speaking of possible answers, the very fact that possible answers are shown with a multiple choice question gives the student a strong hint regarding the answer. In the state question, for example, the student can be fairly certain the answer is not 200. Since a 2 plus 2 question does not show any possible answers, it does not give the student a hint about the answer. As we will see when we get into D2L, you control the precision that D2L questions accept. For the state question, you might require an exact answer, but for calculations, you might allow for a small amount of flexibility. Finally, while not required, you can use random variables to make sure each student gets a different version of the question. This can go a long way towards reducing cheating. Now, let's switch over to D2L. Here we are inside an experimental exam in one of my courses. You can see the two questions I showed you earlier. To create a new 2 plus 2 question, I click on New and Arithmetic Question 2 plus 2. The top part of the question is exactly like any other D2L question. We'll go ahead and build a sample question. I'll use oxygen as the optional title. I'll leave points at 1. I'll also leave difficulty at 1. To be honest, I almost never use the difficulty setting. Now, I'll type in the question. For this example, I'm using a question that requires no calculations. Formula is where you enter the calculations. This question does not require any calculations, so I'll just enter the correct answer of 8. We will come back to the test button later. Answer precision is the number of decimal points in the answer. That is not an issue here, so we'll skip it for now. We will revisit it later. Tolerance is how large of a range you want to allow for the answer. For this question, a range of 1 unit would make any answer from 7 to 9 count as correct. That makes no sense for this question, so we'll skip this for now. I never use units in any of my answers, so we'll completely skip units and evaluation options. Now, we get to the variables. This question does not need a variable. However, 2 plus 2 questions require that you create at least one variable. So, we will have to create a variable that we are never going to use. 2 plus 2 questions only require one variable, so I'll click on the trash icon to remove the second variable. D2L takes me back to the top of the question, so I have to scroll back down. Before we continue, let's look at the fields. Name is the name to use for the variable. Names are limited to 1 or 2 characters and are case sensitive, so capital A is not the same variable as lowercase a. Min is the smallest value this random variable will take on. Max is the largest value this random variable will take on. Decimal places is the maximum number of decimal places in the random variable. Note that the variable could end up having fewer decimal points due to randomness. Step is the minimum distance between random variables. All random values will be some whole number times this value above the minimum value. We're not going to use this variable at all, so I'll use my standard name of A. Minimum of 10, maximum of 100, no decimal points, and step of 1. To be honest, you can enter any values you want here since we are not using them. The only real requirement is that the maximum is larger than the minimum. We're done, so I click on Save. That takes us back to the list of questions in the exam. I'll click on the arrow beside the question to preview it. There you have what the student will see. Below that, you can see that the correct answer is 8. I'll click on Done to close out this question. For the second question, we will write one that uses random variables and calculations. Specifically, we will calculate a break-even point. As you can see on the screen, a break-even point is calculated as a fixed cost divided by the difference between revenue and variable cost. This should be rounded to a whole number, but I never require that. So, now that you've seen the equation for this, let's build the question. When you're going to use calculations, you almost have to add the variables first. So let's scroll down to the variable section. I need 3 variables, so I click on Add Variable to get one more. This time, D2L takes me back to the area I was working in. Remember, variable names are limited to 2 characters and are case sensitive. For the fixed cost, I'll call it FC, give it a minimum value of 10,000, a maximum value of 30,000, and a step of 1,000. As I almost always do, I ignore the decimal place. For the variable cost, I'll call it VC, give it a minimum value of 10, a maximum value of 20, and a step of 1. Now, we run into a couple of 2 plus 2 limitations. First, understand that there's no break-even point unless revenue exceeds variable cost. However, 2 plus 2 questions do not give the student a way of identifying undefined as an answer. So, we must make sure that the random variable for revenue exceeds the random variable for variable cost. That leads us to the second limitation. You cannot base the value of one variable on another variable. So, for example, I cannot say that the revenue variable has a minimum value of the variable cost variable plus 5. That means I must manually handle this when I create the variable. For the revenue, I'll call it R, give it a minimum value of 30, so it always exceeds the variable cost, a maximum value of 50, and a step of 1. That completes the variable creation. Let's enter the formula now. When you use a random variable in either a formula or the question, you must put it inside curly brackets. So, our formula is FC inside curly brackets divided by, open parentheses, R inside curly brackets, minus VC inside curly brackets, close parentheses. I'll also enter a tolerance of 5%. I cannot test the formula yet because D2L will not allow you to test the formula until the question text is entered. As a quick cheat, I'll scroll up and enter text of A. I can now click on Test to test the formula. Notice that even though D2L required that I entered the question text, it is not displayed here. I don't understand that and consider it a significant bug. Either don't require the question text to test the formula or show it here. At the top, you can see the value for each formula. Below that, you see the formula you entered into the D2L question. Next, you see that formula with the variables replaced with the random numbers generated by D2L. Below that, you see the solution. That is, the number that D2L evaluated the equation to. If you have any doubts at all about your formula, double check it now. Finally, you see the range of values that D2L will accept as correct based on the tolerance you entered. If that range is not your liking, you can adjust it when you return to editing the question. We click on Done to return to editing the question. I'll enter break-even as the title and leave the points and difficulty alone. For the question text, I can use the random variables to give those values to the student. Once again, I have to use them with the correct capitalization and inside curly brackets. 2 things to note. First, I put $signs in front of the variable names with no spaces. That's perfectly fine. Second, I do not have to use the variables in the same order I created them below. We're done with the question, so I can click on Save. That takes us back to the exam. Now, let's preview the question. Notice, the variable names have been replaced with their values in the question. D2L automatically added a comma to the fixed cost. The $signs are displayed properly. The answer is shown just as a number. The acceptable range is still there, it is just not shown in this display. Now that you've seen 2 plus 2 questions, let's talk about some of their limitations. Far and away, their biggest limitation is that the variables are not persistent. That is, when you move to the next question, the value of the variables from the last question is no longer available. Why might you want that? It would be nice to be able to show the students a large set of randomly generated numbers, like an income statement, and then ask them a series of questions based on that data set. Currently, the only way to do that is to show an entirely different set of data for each and every question. That is confusing for the students. You can absolutely use complex calculations. My longest set of calculations is this. However, complex calculations like this have to be able to be reduced to a single line. The calculation shown on the screen is a fairly straightforward simple exponential smoothing forecast going several periods into the future. It only looks complex because of the requirement to express it all on one line. Furthermore, the requirement to have everything on one line makes it impossible to use 2 plus 2 questions for some type of problems when you want to use random variables. 2 plus 2 questions are less useful for statistical problems because they do not have the ability to use the standard normal table. That means you have to write the questions with a hardwired significance level. And the standard normal table is just an example. 2 plus 2 questions cannot use any statistical tables. Furthermore, they cannot look up any values. For example, statistical control charts use different values based on the sample size. These are looked up in a table. Since values like this must be hardwired into D2L questions, each student has to get the same sample size. Variables cannot be based on other variables. So, you cannot create a second variable that is always larger than the first variable without some extra thought. We saw this in one of the examples. So there you have 2 plus 2 questions. In spite of some very significant limitations, I use 2 plus 2 questions every single time I need to ask the students for a numeric answer. They are extremely superior to multiple choice questions for numbers.